I really appreciate Dr. Hisham Hellyer making time to discuss just the horrific news that we're all witnessing today, which is Israel's Security Cabinet has decided to occupy Gaza City, which is, of course, no surprise to anyone who's been following this extremist Israeli regime. Dr. Hisham Hellyer is a senior fellow in geopolitics and security studies at the Center for American Progress. He's also a senior fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. He has also written some fantastic columns. Most notably, the recent one is in the Financial Times. He knows Europe, he knows Middle East, and of course, he knows America. And I've invited him to actually ask him how the United States and the international community in particular can pressure this Israeli regime to end its genocide and occupation. Folks, if you've listened to me before, you know that I've repeatedly said that the United States has massive leverage over Israel, right? If Donald Trump literally picks up the phone as president of the United States and gives a call to Netanyahu and threatens to turn off the tap, it's done. But Hisham, as you know, we have the Democratic establishment and the Republican establishment and corporate donors who have, if you will, a different set of priorities than the majority of Americans and even the majority of Europeans, as you've seen the polls, who now, for the first time in my life and your life, I don't think we'd ever have witnessed this before, are decisively pro-Palestinian. So I've given a mouthful to set the stage, but I want to yield the floor to you. We're recording this on a Saturday. Israel's Security Cabinet made the decision yesterday. 61,000 Palestinians killed. That's an undercount. And now they're openly saying they're going to take over Gaza and move the Palestinian people in Gaza to the south. Dr. Hisham.
Well, thank you, Wajahad. Always a pleasure to be on your Substack. There's a few things that I want to sort of make clear from the outset. And first, I think you're correct that there's been a change in public opinion when it comes to this. And you've seen, at least within the West, I think it hasn't changed internationally because I think most of the international community were pretty clear on what was going on. But when it comes to huge parts of Europe, and of course the United States and Canada, I think the mood has shifted somewhat. And I think that's good, but I also think that it's not quote unquote becoming pro-Palestinian. It's
Mm.
simply recognizing that there's no way in any conceivable universe that you could justify the continuation of this in international law or just basic human decency. Now, I would argue that this has been an illegal operation since day one. I think that Israel's response from day one has been completely disproportionate. I think Israel's response did not take into account its responsibilities under international law as the occupying power in Gaza to take care of the civilian population in Gaza. Gaza was not quote unquote a foreign state that Israel was attacked by and then was reacting to. Gaza was and is an occupied territory, and the Israelis have certain responsibilities as a result, being the occupying power. So I think that's important for the framing of this because it also ties in to what not simply the United States, but the international community more widely ought to be doing when it comes to not just this latest announcement that they're going to invade Gaza City, but more widely. And I think that it's an opportune moment to recall that the International Court of Justice said very clearly last year in something that just reconfirmed and reaffirmed something that has been the stance of the international community for decades, that Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights are all occupied territories, that the occupation is illegal, that the Israelis must end their occupation as soon as possible, and that the international community has the obligation to do what it can do to force that to happen. That's not even talking about the war on Gaza. That's not talking about anything in the past 22 months. It's purely talking about the status of Gaza and these other territories as being occupied territories and the Israelis being the occupier. Now, of course, what we've also seen over the last 22 months is, I think, on a global level, a huge concern and anger around how Israel has been waging war on Gaza. Note I said waging war on Gaza because I don't think this is a war on Hamas. Of course, at war with Hamas, but it's a war that expanded uh, instantly far beyond Hamas. And you saw that very clearly in how the civilian death toll just exponentially kept on rising. But also, I think what you've also seen is that the Israelis have prosecuted this war in Gaza, despite the fact that I think global public opinion is so against it, for frankly, two very clear reasons. One, they thought that they had the backing of the United States, and they were correct in this regard. Um, and I think that was true under the Biden administration. And I think it's true most certainly under the Trump administration. Um, and second, they didn't really think that other types of opposition, i.e., from Europe or from elsewhere, um, really had much teeth.
Mm.
And that again, I think is actually quite true. You've seen. I'll say. I mean, I want to be fair here. I don't think that it's true for every state that's been involved in this, but I think it's generally the case that Western countries that do have leverage on Israel to pressure it have not used the leverage that they have in order to force the Israelis to change course. I think that's been very clear for the past 22 months. I think, of course, the most leverage is held and wielded by the United States. So if the United States wanted this to end tomorrow, I agree with you. I think that Donald Trump could, in his capacity as the President of the United States of America, the security guarantor of the Israeli state, the main provider of arms, the protector of Israel at the United Nations Security Council. I mean, on multiple levels, Israel is not just historically indebted to the United States, but remains completely tied to it and reliant upon it. And I think that had the US made it very clear at any point in the past 22 months, this must stop now, I think that we would have seen an end extremely quickly.
And and
But we
I
haven't.
think and I think it's fair to say that it's not just the Trump administration; it's the Biden
No,
administration and the Trump
absolutely.
administration.
Absolutely. No
And this
question.
is where you're at Center for American Progress, which is a left-leaning think tank, influences many Democrats. Right? You have many Democrats who are advisors or were in the Biden administration. Right? They go back and forth at CAP. That's what happens in D.C. Right think tanks, left think tanks. People find a home during the administrations to go back to a think tank. And so there is some leverage there at CAP, right, to influence some of these individuals right now who are senators and Republicans, excuse me, senators and representatives. So at this current moment, Hisham, where the polls are overwhelmingly showing you that Democratic voters are turning away from Israel, that young people around the world are radicalized in real time, it does not seem to me to be a smart political move for Democrats to continue on the kind of unconditional support for Israel. What
Mm.
are you seeing right now with Democrats before we get to Republicans?
So I think it's very true that at least among voters for the Democratic Party, opinion is very clear. And it has gotten progressively more clear, let's say, over the past 22 months. Um, Young people generally around the country, of both of any political persuasion, are not particularly happy with the way that Israel is prosecuting this war. Sympathy for the Palestinians is strongest among democratic voters, but I think it's also an age thing in this regard as well, that younger Americans feel more sympathy than older Americans at this point. But strongest of all are going to be young Democratic voters, and then Democratic voters more generally speaking. So it is frankly a vote getter if we're talking about just pure public opinion. In my opinion, at least, it is simply stated a pure vote getter to be much more clear about the need for Israel to abide by international law. Now, there are a couple of things here, though, I think have to be said. One, not every potential vote is actually going to become a real vote. And what I mean by that is that unfortunately, and I think we saw this during the last presidential election, not everybody goes out to vote. Okay, so I think what you saw, and this I think is one of the big stories of that election, which I think a lot of people have written on. Um, you didn't have as many people go out who were going to vote Democrat as you did last time.
Yeah, they
A
say
lot of them stayed home. They stayed home. And you actually did have on the other side a lot of people who were going to vote. They're the ones that actually came out. Okay, so if you quote unquote forced everybody, okay, or if you did like a literally going door to door and saying, who would you want to vote for? Then I think that the picture would have been very, very different. But of course, that's not how it works in American democracy. You actually have to physically get up and go to the polling booth or, send off your ballot and so on. And I think that I think this is also probably what's going on in the minds of the Democratic Party. Um, it's not simply about public opinion and even democratic public opinion, but who are the ones that are actually going to go? And of course, on an elite level, i.e., I think a lot of Democratic donors and so on, I think that they're of a different generation and age, and they're still quite supportive of the historic backing the United States has given the state of Israel for a variety of reasons. Now, I do think that this again is a generational issue, and that generation is changing, i.e., it's passing on to the next generation. And I think it would be very bizarre for anyone to assume that when you have the next wave of Democratic congressmen or senators come into Congress and the Senate, that they're not going to be very, very different. I mean, today we think of, someone like AOC as being, really far out there. I imagine that's not going to be the case when we think about this in 5 years' time, for example,
I
or
think
10
even
years'
less.
time.
I think even less. I think
Yeah.
2028, this will be, it's already, you're seeing it, that this has become one of those issues, divisive issues, where if you're not on the
Yes.
right side of history, voters are like, I'm done with you. And there was I don't know if you saw earlier this week, New York Times had a piece about Zoran Mamdani, who's running for mayor, who
Yeah.
right now has more, as of today, a report came out that he has more support than all the other candidates combined.
Yeah,
So he's
it's
now,
very Trumpian. It's
yeah.
it's it's ironic. It's the only thing he probably shares with Donald Trump, and that he completely, wiped through the competition. But I think that that's
But
also a testament to
did you
exactly
see
what
the
we were
fact
talking about.
did you see the fact that that article that came out that said the majority of young Jewish voters in New York
Absolutely,
support
yeah,
Mamdani not in
absolutely.
spite of but because of his views on
Because
Gaza?
of, yeah.
Yeah.
And but see the age. This is why like I keep on going to like the generational divide on this. And that's important. I think that when you look at, anything under 40, it's extremely unlikely across religious groups and non-religious groups. So it frankly did not surprise me that the majority of Jewish Americans in New York City were going to be much more left wing on this particular issue um, than what I think people would have expected. It didn't surprise me because I think that that's true across the country of Jewish Americans, but just Americans. I think young Americans, generally speaking, are just really not happy at all and really want the Democratic Party to move in a particular direction.
If let me ask this question, which might sound it's silly saying it out loud, but there's so much chaos that you have to make sense of the chaos sometimes. With what you've described, with the polls, young people, Democrats, people all around the world, in Europe, in Australia, there was a huge pro-Palestinian march,
Yeah.
even in the rain, 300,000 people, right?
Hmm.
With Israel becoming a pariah state, with Israel openly committing a genocide, with allegations of genocide, war crimes, with the ICC going against Israel, right? It seems clear to anyone that if you cared about your political future and if you saw all the tea leaves, it is in your interest, especially as a Democrat, even a Republican, though, even when it comes to young Republicans, there's fissures to side with Palestinians. With all that being said, then the question anyone would have is why, Hisham? Why, after 22 months, is the establishment, Donald Trump, Chuck Schumer, all these other folks still riding with Israel?
So I think the answer to that question does differ across political party, and also within the political party. So yes, you're right. There is a rift within the Republican Party on support for the state of Israel in this fashion. I have to say the rift is extremely different, in my opinion, than the discussions that are happening within the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Because I don't think people like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens have quite the same sort of motivations than let's say Jewish Voices for Peace or something. All right. I mean, there's something else going on there. Um, and I think the Republicans are dealing with the internal contradictions that they have embedded within them
Mm.
when they call for America first and at the same time express such frankly irrational support for another country. Okay. And I think you see that sort of attitude being exemplified by certain parts of MAGA. But I don't know how widespread it is within MAGA. And I don't think it's born out of a sense that they need to be more aligned with supporting a Palestinian state or something. Okay. Rather, it's just pure anger at what's going on, and also expressing this discontent at providing such huge financial and military resources to another place. Okay. And there are probably other things going on there as well, but
I'll go ahead and say anti-Semitism. Also, some
yeah,
anti-Semitism and white
I
nationalist
wouldn't be
conspiracies.
surprised. I wouldn't be surprised because I think you've seen that. I mean, it's quite intriguing that you see this blatant anti-Semitism being expressed in certain quarters, and yet it doesn't seem to tar, the overall message of the party, despite the fact that these messages seem to be incredibly tolerated in many ways, including, I have to say, here there's a part of the non-pro-Israel camp, okay, that I think is probably motivated by that. But then also there are lots of people who are incredibly pro-Israel who express the most wild anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Okay. And in some regards it ties together with this notion that, we've got to have all the Jews over there because then the rupture will take place. And I mean, none of this is good news for Jewish people.
None.
You know,
Terrible.
and I think a lot of Jewish Americans have expressed this concern quite a lot, not just in the past couple of years, but much further back than that. Um, and is why it became so strange when you saw some of these really historical, not just in the U.S. but just in the West more generally, some of the most horrendous people when it came to anti-Semitism being touted as these pro-Israel political forces, and of course they are pro-Israel, but they're not pro-Jewish. That's for sure.
You're
And
talking
you
about
think about this.
specifically evangelical Christians, Christians United for Israel, this type of Christian
I won't say
Zionism.
I won't say all evangelical Christians, but yes, of course, there is a part of the evangelical Christian community that engages in things that I find really peculiar when it comes, to say the least, when it comes to Jewish Americans. In Europe, you see this with the AfD. Where they're very pro-Israel, but they don't have a great track record when it comes to anti-Semitism. Okay, like they put it very lightly. And then you'll see this in other parts of Europe as well. So there is that stuff going on. When it comes to the Democrats, oh no, so and then I'll say also when it comes to the Republicans, I think politics in large part is going to be about money, and I think you have until now not many people on the Republican side who are big donors of the Republican Party um, wanting to step out for a variety of reasons, but wanting to step out of that historical, quote unquote, pro-Israel kind of direction. I think it's different in the Democratic Party. I think that there's a mix involved there, but I don't know of any even big America First, MAGA, etc., financial support base in the Republican Party that would be willing to put money, for example, behind candidates that were taking a more critical line when it came to the Israelis. You might find fewer people wanting to put money behind very pro-Israel candidates in the future, but you're not finding people that want to put money behind candidates that would be more aggressive about this issue. Okay, this is different with the Democrats. I think with the Democrats, you have a new base of financial support among American voters that want to have candidates that are more supportive of a balanced approach to this issue of support for international law. So there's a genuine discussion going on there. I don't know how far this discussion is actually within the Republican Party at present, because it's certainly not that prominent among the Republican base. We see this rift, but the rift that we're talking about is really about influencers online. They have a following. I'm not saying they don't have a following, but is that following going to be motivated about this issue to then back candidates, whether Congress people or senators, to take different policy measures, or simply want to stay out of it? And my suspicion at this moment is that it'd be more the latter than the former. Whereas in the Democratic Party, no, you'll find people who want to support candidates that will go toe to toe on this issue.
You
And I
know,
think that's the difference.
before I move on to ask you about security, it is interesting. This week, briefly was in the news that Donald Trump threatened any city and any state. I don't know if you saw this. He threatened to withhold aid, disaster aid, to any city and any state in America that would boycott Israel. Well, that
Mhm.
lasted 3 hours. And the reason why that lasted 3 hours is because online, the America First movement, this little faction, right, within MAGA, which is splinter on this issue, said, what the hell? Why the hell are you going to do this for another foreign country, Israel? Are we
Yeah.
MAGA or MEGA, make Israel great again? And within 3 hours, then the White House said, okay, okay, sorry, sir, never mind, my bad. It's very fascinating to see how these splits are happening both within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And I agree with you, much more so and much more pronounced when it comes to the Democratic base, Democratic institutions, Democratic funders. But these online influencers aren't just online influencers. Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Marjorie Taylor Greene this week has gone hard
Mhm.
in the paint against Israel.
Mhm.
There are 11 members of the House of Representatives who actually use the G word, genocide. 10 Democrats
She's one of them. Yeah.
and Marjorie Taylor Greene, the 11. And then you
Yeah.
saw last week 27 Democratic senators. I'm going to include Bernie Sanders,
Yes.
who for the first time a majority should be all of them, but this is we live in like the bar is so low, Hisham, it's in hell. So we take what we can get. 27 senators, including Bernie Sanders, all voted to stop aid to Israel, right? Because they see the starvation campaign, literally man-made starvation, which is killing
Mhm.
Palestinian children every day. We're witnessing a shift. Again, we don't know what's going to happen, but what we do know what is happening is a genocide. You're comfortable using the word. I'm comfortable using that word. You're seeing now Israel openly say, we're going to occupy. You're seeing them say, we're going to transfer and move Palestinians. That's ethnic cleansing. I want to ask you, as an expert on geopolitics and security, uh, uh, let's talk about the security, but let's talk about three groups in particular. Let's start with the victims, Palestinians, and then let's then talk about Israel itself, because whenever I go to Israel and Palestine, they always say we got to do this for security, 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 and everything that they seem to be doing, to me, uh, just looking at it, not as an expert, I'm like, you will be more insecure. And then the Middle Eastern region itself. So let's start with Palestinians. What's the future of Palestinians with Israel's stated goals to occupy and go river to the sea?
So a few things again, and I want to say this because I think your viewers also need to understand how even the Israelis put this. So they don't use the word transfer. They say voluntary migration.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Of course, this is a complete nonsense in fiction because there's nothing voluntary about this situation. They don't have a real choice. They've made Gaza uninhabitable. So if people do leave, it's not because they want to leave, it's because they have absolutely no way to stay and survive. Okay, so it's not a real choice. When they say voluntary, there's nothing voluntary about it. Um, what's being discussed here is expulsion. And in some cases, they are literally being expelled. Okay. In some cases, they're being told ahead of time, evacuate. Again, it's mythical. When you evacuate, the presumption is that you will be allowed to come back. Okay. In this case, you are not being allowed to come back, and there's nothing to come back to. So I think that's also very important. There are expulsions that are literally taking place throughout Gaza as well as in the West Bank. where armed Jewish settlers in the West Bank are going and they're taking over in different parts of the West Bank and with the full support of the Israeli state. And then, of course, there's these quote unquote evacuation orders um, and the voluntary migration. Of course, their biggest problem with the voluntary migration strategy is that there's nowhere that they can deport them to or have them go to. But that's one aspect of what's going on. Um, of course, it's not an occupation because it's already been occupied. And this is something else that, again, your viewers really need to understand. The occupation started in 1967. It has not ended at any point since then. Confusion happens because in 2005 there was quote unquote the it wasn't a withdrawal, but it was called disengagement from Gaza, which meant that the Israelis continued to be in occupation of the territory of Gaza, but without being on the ground within the Gaza Strip itself. But they controlled all of the borders and the land registry and so on and so forth.
And
So
they
that's
moved the
why
settlers. They moved some of the settlers that were in Gaza. That's
the
it, but they still
settlers,
control.
yeah, yeah. So there was no more. The Israelis weren't on the ground in Gaza post 2005, post the disengagement plan, but that didn't mean that they weren't in occupation of Gaza, and that's why the ICC, the ICJ, the international community has consistently since 2005 recognized that Gaza is an occupied territory and that the occupying territory is the state of Israel. This, by the way, was the stated position of the United States up until very, very recently, like maybe 3 years ago, 2 years ago. And then it becomes like befuddled um, and a subject of debate or discussion. But up until then, it was extremely clear. Um, so what we're talking about here is the invasion of Gaza City and turning Gaza City basically into rubble,
Yeah.
and making sure the Palestinians are quote unquote relocated down south. And the defense minister, Israel Katz, made it very clear. He said, we want to establish a camp, okay, where we will concentrate, Palestinians in the south near the border with Egypt. Ehud Olmert, who's the previous prime minister of Israel, by the way, a right-wing Israeli prime minister, who also does not have a great track record when it comes to engaging with the Palestinians when he was actually prime minister. He came out and said, this is a concentration camp. Okay,
You're
you had
looking
an
into that as well.
Israeli former prime minister saying it's a concentration camp that is being suggested here. Okay, and I think that's very striking. I mean, you mentioned genocide. It's very striking that you have Israeli human rights groups, including the largest one, the most famous one, B'Tselem. You have quite a few states, including in Europe. You have many politicians. You have the former Attorney General of Israel. You have so many people. You have the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Okay, I mean, literally, it's so across the board right now that I can understand if certain people don't want to use the word, but to argue that it should not be used, I think is extraordinary. Like the president of J Street, I think, like also came out recently
This
and
week.
and said I'm not gonna argue about it anymore.
Yeah, Jeremy
You know?
Ben-Ami this week said, I personally won't use it, but I understand why people are using the word
Yeah,
genocide.
because it becomes impossible for you to have an argument in this regard. Maybe you don't want to use it for a bunch of different reasons, but there are technical definitions, there are legal definitions, and I completely understand why some people want to say, I don't want to use the word until the ICJ comes out and makes a ruling. Fine, very good. But you can't stop other people from using the word, especially when the ICJ itself said that there is a duty upon states to prevent genocide in Gaza, which meant that the ICJ recognized that it was plausible. It didn't conclude there was genocide, but it did recognize that it was plausible that genocide was taking place. And this was January last year, January 2024. Okay. So I don't know how you get around that if you're sincere about international law. So of course this is extremely bad when it comes to the Palestinians. They're already in a horrible situation. It is forced starvation. It's not by accident. Okay. It's very clear what's going on in terms of, and you ask UNICEF, you ask the WHO, you ask the World Food Program, you ask any humanitarian organization that's on the ground, and they'll tell you that that has been on the ground. They're no longer allowed to actually operate properly, and they will tell you how serious all of this is, and how the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is just a complete and total, misnomer. People are getting shot approaching these depots and so on. I mean, it's striking. We're coming up to the anniversary of October 7th, a really truly horrible set of events. And there are more people that have been killed probably in a week trying to approach these depots than all civilians that were killed on October 7th.
Yeah, since May.
Okay. Okay. Let alone the fact that we're talking about tens of thousands of people that have been killed over the past 10 months, including, and then on top of that, many, many that are still under the rubble. The 61,000, which seems to be the number people are banding around at the moment, because that's what the Gaza Health Ministry talks about, I think is a huge undercount.
Well, it's not just you, it's
Um,
Lancet. Lancet, the medical journal, said that it's probably
yeah.
an undercount by
No, no, I,
40%. And then
uh,
also, you mentioned injured, the number of injured, we were talking about also
oh
amputees,
God,
about
yeah, no.
150,000.
Oh no, so and that's injured, but then also you can't even begin to count how long you will be crediting and attributing the last 2 years to injuries and illnesses that will go on for at least a generation, if not more. Okay. I mean, nobody in Gaza today is going to get out of this. If they get out of it alive, none of them will get out of it without being tremendously scarred in either physically or mentally or both. Okay, I mean it's absolutely horrendous.
So basically, just complete terror, displacement, genocide, concentration camps, starvation for the Palestinian people. Just immense misery on top of the misery they've been experiencing for decades. Um, when it comes to the security angle, right? Because a lot of people, unfortunately, when it comes to dehumanization, they're like, okay, well, but Israel will be safe at least. I believe, and you've already alluded to this, this is terrible for Israel and also for Jews. But your take on it, you're the expert.
Yeah, so I mean, I answer this question because, it's important to, take all of the angles into account. Of course, um, the biggest consequences to Palestinians. It's not Israelis, but if I were an Israeli security analyst trying to understand what this means for my community, then if I were honest, I would have to say this is a really bad idea. And it's a bad idea because not just this particular invasion of Gaza City, but just the last not only 2 years, but I would argue going back beyond that. Because if my intention is that the state of Israel becomes secure, there's no way for it to be secure if it does not have peaceful relations with its neighbors and the wider region. Okay, otherwise it will be constantly under threat, right? The only way that Israel continues to survive as a state in the region is because it has a massive guarantor and security relationship with the United States. Okay. That's one. And two, that the rest of the region simply doesn't have the military power or prowess to be able to tackle and take on the state of Israel. Um, if these two things were flipped, then I think it would be extremely dangerous for the state of Israel. Okay. So I don't think this is a very, how should I say, durable or sustainable state of affairs for the Israelis to feel comfortable with, because you talked about rifts when it comes to MAGA. There's also very clearly a generational change taking place in the Democratic Party. Public opinion in North America, in the West more generally, is not becoming more pro-Israel. On the contrary, it's going in the opposite direction. Um, so that sort of like diehard support, I don't think is something that they can count on indefinitely.
Nope.
Um, and when it comes to the region, the amount of anger
Yeah.
that exists throughout, not just, I mean, obviously there's anger in Gaza, there's anger in the occupied territories in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, there's anger among Palestinian Israelis who are within the Green Line, there's anger all through that. Okay, but what about Lebanon? What about Syria? What about Egypt? What about Jordan? Going further beyond that, what about
Yemen.
Saudi? What about Algeria? What about Libya? What, I mean, basically, what about everybody? Like literally, what about everybody in the region that you want to be normalized in? There's so much anger about how Israel has conducted the past 2 months. So I find it extraordinary to see people still arguing that it's possible that you're going to see normalization with Saudi Arabia in very quickly, and that the Abraham Accords are going to be expanded and all this sort of stuff. It's like I don't know which planet you live on because there's no possible scenario where in the short or medium term I see that as being remotely likely.
And
There's nothing.
also, Dr. Hisham, in the past 22 months, Israel has also engaged in 35,000 targeted strikes against Palestinians, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen.
Yes.
That's another
Yeah,
fact
absolutely.
that people don't
No, no.
talk
So
about.
that's also the source of the anger. Okay, so um, when it comes to, I mean, when you just look in the past, like maybe 4 months, they struck Yemen, they struck Syria, they struck Lebanon. And by the way, this hasn't stopped. They still strike Lebanon. They still strike Syria. They've occupied the Golan Heights since 1967 when the Assad regime fell, which is absolutely odious and grotesque regime. They invaded even more Syrian territory and occupied even more Syrian territory. It's like, well done. You just turned all Syrians into, I mean, they didn't like you to begin with. Now they really, I mean, what are you trying to do here? And when it came to the Iranians, they bombed them too, while the Iranians were involved in a negotiation with the United States. I have 100 different reasons to be critical of the Iranians, a regime that, again, I find particularly grotesque for multiple reasons, not least of which have to do with Syria. But they were involved in a negotiation with the United States, and the Israelis bombed. Okay. So and I said this at the time, even if you're in the Gulf and you have deep reticence about the Iranians, as the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis do, you're not feeling happy about any of this because it gives Israel the sense of freedom of action with utter impunity, without any consequences, which means that they can turn and strike anywhere that they like in the future. And indeed, they've made it very clear. For example, when it comes to Syria, um, one of the ministers in Netanyahu's cabinet saying that the end game for Syria is its dismemberment, i.e., splitting it up in like different states. Okay. You have the latest Israeli ambassador to Washington, D.C. Um, being cited earlier this year, I think it was January or February, talking about Egypt, as though I'm paraphrasing here. I'm not quoting him verbatim, but talking about Egypt as like the next threat or something, because Egypt moved more forces into the Sinai at a time when there's a massive war that Israel is conducting in Gaza. Somehow it was bizarre to the Israelis that the Egyptians would put more forces into the Sinai. Really? Like, I
It's
mean,
a drunk nuclear power that engages in drunk driving accidents, and the United States says, "Okay, Israel, don't do it again." And this time, in order to make sure that you actually sober up, here's a Porsche. It is
yeah.
madness happening in real time,
Well,
Hisham.
actually, I think that was the Biden administration's tack. I think it's actually, on one level, maybe more honest during the Trump administration because
Much more
I don't. There's
transparent
no
and
even
naked.
wagging of the finger. There's no even wagging of the finger now.
It it's
So I
madness.
don't. So
But I do want to ask you this question, just to wrap up. I mean, and inshallah, please come back anytime. Is with everything that you've laid out, it seems very logical to me. We're seeing it in real time. We have to believe the evidence of our eyes. It's terrible for Palestinians, first and foremost, a genocide. I agree with you. I think this is terrible for Israel and Jews, Jews in Israel and Jews abroad. Israel has become worse than South Africa in the 80s, right? Because South Africa was become made a
Yeah.
pariah due to apartheid. This is apartheid and occupation and genocide.
Mhm.
Terrible for the region. Terrible for the United States. My final question to you is, you're at CAP, Center for American Progress. I'm an American. We're going back full circle. We're seeing young people turn the tide. Your recommendation, because people listen to you, to people in the security sector to stop this, end this right now.
Um, so I'm afraid to tell you, I'm not sure that they'd listen. They might hear, but whether they listen is another question. And I think, unfortunately, again, what we've seen over the past couple of years is on multiple occasions, the Israelis have been abundantly clear about what they intend to do, and then they do it. And while this is going on, people like myself, I'm not the only one. I wish there were more, but I'm certainly not the only one, come out and say, this is what's being suggested. This is what you must stop. So take steps to stop it. And they don't. Okay. And then people act surprised when the Israelis feel empowered to do more. And I think that this is true of any power. In this regard, the Israelis are not exceptional. If you give any power the impression that they can act with full impunity and still be empowered by especially the most powerful country in the world, then they're going to start doing a lot of stuff that is just really bad. Um, and I think that this is a very dangerous scenario that can spiral very easily at any time. I think that if you are truly concerned about the long-term stability of the region, including um, Israelis, okay, then you should really consider um, what is the most likely way to truly normalize Israelis in the region. This is not it. This is a surefire way of making sure that at least another generation, if not two or three, will reject any sort of normalization of Israelis. I don't think that there's any way for people to be really, honest with the situation and see it otherwise. The images on people's screens, but also the the frankly very open um, media environment when it comes to this in Israel shows that Israeli society is also in a very, very, very dark place when it comes to what's going on. And this is all evident to anybody that reads Israeli media and looks at the polls. Opposition to this war has been quite consistent over the past 2 years. It's not about the war per se, it's about the hostages. And I think people miss this. They think that because there are all these protests, that it means the majority of Israelis are against the war because the war is bad. No, they're against the war because they want their hostages back, and they think that conducting the war is not actually going to get their hostages back. But when you actually ask about the suffering of Palestinians and the human cost of Palestinians, it's a very worrying picture indeed. And this does not this isn't something that people miss, I think, more broadly in the region. So I think that if people really want to see a future where Israelis are normalized, then they need to push the Israelis to change course. And this is fundamentally an American issue because it is the United States of America that is able to change the calculus on this literally in a day and a night.
With a phone
Um,
call. With a phone call.
yeah,
It's happened before.
literally in a day and a night.
Hisham, thank you so much for your time. Hope you can come back anytime. This has been Dr. Hisham Hellyer, Senior Fellow in Geopolitics and Security Studies at Center for American Progress, also Senior Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RISU. Just wrote a fantastic article in the Financial Times, which I will link. And folks, we're witnessing this in real time. This is genocide in real time, and everyone has a voice, and especially if you're an American or especially if you're in Europe and the UK and Canada, you can use your voice. You can call your elected officials. The polls are changing. We've never seen this happen in our lifetime. And sometimes a best friend, if you will, intervenes. It does not enable. And specifically for Americans who are listening, that's us. If we have this special relationship with Israel, our job is not to enable the drunk driver. It is to stop them and get them into rehab. Folks, this has been The Left Hook. There are no paywalls here. Everything's for free. If you have a few dollars, become a paid subscriber. If not, just share this content. I've been talking to Dr. Hisham Hellyer, and again, I'm going to link to his fantastic article. People, be kind, be empathetic, and please, oh, please don't be either genocidal or a fascist. Take care.